Born on May 19th, 1870 in Washington, D.C., to Randall and Ellen Fish, Hamilton Howard Albert Fish was born, and he went by many different names: the Brooklyn Vampire, the Werewolf of Wisteria, and his famous name, the Gray Man. As a child, Fish was plagued by mental illness, as were a number of his family members. Not only was his brother in an asylum, but his uncle had been diagnosed with mania, while his mother routinely experienced visual hallucinations. His father was 75 years old at the time of Fish's birth and died when Albert was just 5 years old. His widowed mother didn't have the resources to care of Albert and his 3 siblings and left them all alone in an orphanage. The caretakers at the orphanage would regularly beat the children and then also encourage the children to beat each other up. He came to enjoy and associate the pain with pleasure, which would later capture his taste for sexual gratification. When his mother became mentally stable and financially stable, she took Albert home in 1880. She removed him from the orphanage, but the damage had already been done. Fish not only continued to enjoy his own beatings, but began an unhealthy relationship with a telegraph boy in 1882. The child introduced him to sexual practices of urolagnia and coprophagia, the consumption of human waste. Eventually, his tendencies led him to an obsession of sexual mutilation. He would regularly embed needles into his groin and abdomen and flog himself with a nail-studded paddle. And in 1890, after a 20-year-old Fish moved to New York City, his crimes against children began.
The innocence of America shone through in the early decades of the 20th century, as parents let their children play unattended and unguarded on the streets of New York. There was no such concept as stranger danger in the poor communities, as they felt kidnappers would not target the children of those who could not pay a ransom. Yet children continued to disappear.
He felt driven to torment and kill children. Sometimes he would gag them, tie them up, and beat them, although he preferred not to gag them, circumstances permitting, for he liked to hear their cries.
Fish became increasingly curious about the pain of others and wasted no time after arriving in New York City. He started prostituting himself and molesting young boys whom he lured from their homes to rape and torture. A nail-studded paddle was his favorite weapon to use. Remarkably, in 1898, Fisher married a woman his mother had introduced him to, and he had 6 children with her. While he never violently abused his own, Fish continued raping and torturing other children throughout their childhood. By 1917, Fish had difficulty concealing the symptoms of severe mental illness, leading his wife to leave him for another man. Fish's self-harm grew thereafter, from pressing more and more needles into his groin to stuffing wool-covered lighter fluid into his anus and setting it on fire. He began having hallucinations as well. At one point, he recalled wrapping himself in a carpet of the instructions of John the Apostle. Fish began teaching his own children strange and oddly weird stuff and games, before developing an obsession for cannibalism. As his precursor to consuming human flesh, he began to eat raw meat, meals he often invited his children to share. By 1919, his obsession with torture and cannibalism had brought him to contemplate murder. He began to look for vulnerable children such as intellectually disabled orphans or homeless black children, youths that he assumed wouldn't be missed. He would claim at his trial and later writings that God was speaking to him, commanding him to torture and consume any young children. He put on advertisements in local papers, put out by families looking for someone to perform housework or by young men looking for work themselves. It was through one of these advertisements that he found young Grace Budd. Grace wasn't always Albert Fish's intended target. It was her older brother that he had set his eyes on. Edward Budd was looking for some work in a farm or in the country. That's why he put out the ad Fish encountered. Fish originally planned on hiring Edward and bringing him out to his country house to torture him. Under the false name Frank Howard, Fish called on the Budd family and their Manhattan home. He claimed to have some farm work upstate that needed doing, and he was also looking for someone to help around the house. Edward was inclined to take the job from the unremarkable gray-faced gentleman, But suddenly, Fish's interest shifted. While Edward was mulling over his offer, Fish noticed a young girl standing behind her parents, 10-year-old Grace Budd, and he had a new plan and he didn't waste any time. While discussing his farm and the imaginary work Edward would undertake, Fish casually mentioned that he was in town to visit his niece and attend her birthday party, and asked little Grace to join him. Albert Fish, the unassuming-looking stranger, and the gray-faced man convinced Delia and Albert Budd to let him take his daughter along to his niece's birthday party, and they never saw her again. Fish took Grace, dressed in her Sunday best, to her uphouse state, the same one he had intended to use as a torture chamber for her brother. According to the letter sent to Delia Budd, along with his confession, Fish hid in an upstairs bedroom naked, so he did not get blood on his clothing while Grace picked wildflowers in the yard. Then he called her inside. When she screamed at the sight of him, he grabbed before she could flee. In his gruesome letter read, "First I stripped her naked, how she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take it to the kitchen, cook it, and I ate it. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body." The letter, which had clearly been intended to cause panic within the Budd home, started Albert Fish's downfall. The paper he had written the letter on happened to be a piece of stationery from the New York's Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. Police inquired with the company and found the paper had been left behind by a janitor from the company at a rooming house he'd been staying at. At the same rooming house, a man named Albert Fish was renting a place. Upon learning that Fish had a strong resemblance to Frank Howard, Grace Budd's kidnapper, the police set up an interview. To their surprise, Fish confessed in an instant, practically tipping over himself to reveal his precise details of what he'd done to Grace Budd, as well as dozens of other children.
Fish was charged with the murder of Grace Budd. He also confessed to at least 100 other incidents. "I've had children in every state," Fish teased. He was sentenced to die in the electric chair at Sing Sing. On January 16, 1936, Fish ate his last meals. For lunch, he had a T-bone steak. For dinner, he had a roast chicken, but he barely touched it. Later that night, after a 6-year manhunt, the state of New York finally put an end to Fish's unspeakable appetites by executing him in the electric chair. Fish had even been looking forward to his electrocution. "It'll be the supreme thrill, the only one I haven't tried," he exclaimed. But even Fish's execution didn't come off easy.
When he was in jail, he began complaining that he was having this difficulty sitting and so on and so forth. And when the prison physicians came to talk to him about it, he said that one form of pleasure that he got was inserting needles up between his legs into his perineum and leaving them lodged inside his lower body. And of course, nobody believed this was the case, and they x-rayed him, and in fact, they found, when the x-rays were developed, they found there were the 27 needles of varying sizes that were shoved up into his pelvic region. This was just one of many forms of incredibly masochistic behavior that Fish indulged in. You know, he was a masochist and a sadist, a classic case of someone for whom pleasure and pain are completely inseparable.
During the electrocution, all of the metal in his body caused a short circuit during the first shock. It took 2 massive jolts of electricity to kill him. At age 65, Fish was the oldest man ever executed at Sing Sing. So 50 years before America's favorite cinematic carnivore, Hannibal Lecter, there was Albert Fish, house painter, father of 6, and cannibal.